At 64 years old, Helen Marsh had always believed that a woman who gives everything, her time, her youth, her voice, her very identity, deserves at least the dignity of being acknowledged. After 22 years of quietly holding together a life that never truly belonged to her, she walked out of a courtroom with nothing but a crumpled $20 bill, the cardigan on her back, and the rusted keys to a house on the edge of Greystone, Vermont, that no one in town had dared enter in over a decade. But what Helen found behind that weathered front door didn't just change everything she thought she knew. It unraveled secrets that shook an entire town, silenced the people who had humiliated her, and proved that the most devastating endings are sometimes the most extraordinary beginnings in disguise. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. If you have ever been discarded by someone who should have protected you, if you've been made to feel invisible by the very people you sacrificed everything for, if you've ever stood in the rubble of a life you built for someone else and wondered how on earth you would survive what came next, this story is for you. Welcome. And please, stay until the very end, because what Helen Marsh found inside that house is something none of us saw coming. Helen was not the kind of woman who attracted attention. She had spent most of her adult life making sure of that. Quiet, capable, efficient. These were the words people used to describe her when they bothered to describe her at all. She had a rare gift for making things run smoothly, for absorbing chaos and returning calm, for being the kind of person who holds everything together without ever being thanked for it. She was, in the truest and most painful sense of the word, invisible. And for 22 years, she had convinced herself that invisibility was simply the price of love. She had met Gerald Marsh at 42 at a company dinner hosted by the architectural firm where she worked as an office manager. Gerald was 51, handsome in an authoritative way, a successful property developer with a well-known reputation for turning neglected, forgotten buildings into profitable assets. He was charming that evening, attentive in a way that felt genuinely rare, the kind of man who makes you feel like the most important person in the room without even appearing to try. Helen, who had spent her 30s quietly managing everyone else's crises while watching friends build families and lives of their own, had been completely unprepared for that kind of focused, deliberate attention. They were married 14 months later in a modest ceremony in Burlington, and Helen had walked down that aisle absolutely certain that she had finally, at long last, found the place where she truly belonged. Gerald had 3 children from his first marriage. Rebecca was 30 at the time of the wedding, already sharp-edged and territorial, a younger version of everything Helen would eventually come to understand and fear. Derek was 27, quieter than his sister, but every bit as calculating, always watching, always measuring, always cataloging grievances he never quite voiced directly. Travis was 24, the youngest, and perhaps the most openly hostile of the 3. A young man who seemed to view his father's remarriage as a personal betrayal he had every intention of punishing Helen for, indefinitely and without apology. None of them wanted her there. They made that clear within the first hour of the reception, and they never once stopped making it clear across the 22 years that followed. But Helen tried anyway, because that was simply who she was. She tried with birthday cards and elaborately prepared holiday dinners, with patient silences absorbing sharp words that should never have been spoken, with open doors and carefully chosen gifts that were accepted without thanks and forgotten immediately. She managed Gerald's household with the same quiet precision she had once applied to managing his professional correspondence. Because 3 years into the marriage, Gerald had suggested she leave her job and focus entirely on their home, and Helen had said yes without hesitation, because she loved him and because she believed, deeply and without reservation, that the life they were building together was worth any sacrifice she was asked to make. It was always going to be worth it. That was the story she told herself through years of cutting remarks about her lack of professional accomplishments, through family gatherings where Gerald's children spoke over her and around her, as though she were simply another piece of furniture that had come with the house, through holidays where she cooked for hours and cleared the table alone while the conversation continued without a single acknowledgement that she existed. It was going to be worth it. Right up until the morning Gerald sat across from her at the kitchen table, she had refinished herself by hand, slid a manila folder across the wood surface, and said, in a voice that contained absolutely no trace of the man she thought she had married, "I want a divorce, Helen. I've already spoken to my attorney." She remembered staring at that folder for a very long time before she reached for it. She remembered the ordinary morning light falling across the kitchen she had designed, the smell of the coffee she had just brewed, the heartbreaking normalcy of the moment in which her life came apart. She was 64 years old with no independent income, no career to return to, no savings that were entirely her own, and no idea what came next. She had given 2 decades of her life to a man who was now passing legal documents across the breakfast table like they were grocery receipts. And beneath the shock, beneath the grief and the gathering terror of what lay ahead, a small, quiet voice whispered something she had spent years refusing to hear. That she had always, somewhere deep down, known this was coming. She had simply loved him too much, or perhaps too desperately, to listen. What happened next would test every last ounce of strength Helen Marsh possessed, and what she would discover at the end of it all, behind the door of a house the entire town of Greystone had avoided for 11 long years, would change not just her life, but the lives of everyone who had ever dared to underestimate her. Helen and Carver had been born and raised in a small town outside of Montpelier, Vermont, the only daughter of a schoolteacher mother and a father who repaired watches for a living. It was a quiet childhood, modest and unhurried, filled with the kind of ordinary beauty that only reveals itself in retrospect. Sunday dinners that lasted for hours, a backyard garden her mother tended with religious devotion, the particular smell of her father's workshop, oil and metal, and the faint sweetness of wood shavings. She had grown up understanding, through observation rather than instruction, that love was demonstrated through service. That care was expressed through action. That the highest form of devotion was simply showing up consistently and without complaint for the people who needed you. It was a lesson that would serve her beautifully in some areas of her life and devastate her completely in others. She had been a capable student, practical rather than academic, the kind of young woman who was genuinely excellent at organizing complexity and making difficult things appear effortless. After 2 years of community college, she had taken a job at a small architectural firm in Burlington as a receptionist, and within 4 years had quietly and methodically worked her way into the role of office manager, becoming the operational backbone of an office that would have collapsed without her. She was good at her work in the way that truly competent people often are, so good and so unassuming about it, that her contributions were rarely noticed until the rare occasions when she wasn't there to make them. She had a small apartment she was proud of, a handful of close friends she treasured, a life that was genuinely hers. It was not glamorous, but it was real, and it was built entirely on her own terms. Then she met Gerald Marsh at 51, and everything that had been hers began, slowly and almost imperceptibly at first, to belong to someone else. Gerald was the kind of man who filled a room without appearing to try. He was tall, silver-haired, possessed of an easy confidence that came from decades of financial success and the social standing that accompanied it. He developed properties across Vermont and New Hampshire, turning overlooked buildings and forgotten parcels of land into profitable ventures with the calm certainty of someone who had never seriously doubted his own judgment. He was respected in professional circles, admired in social ones, and broadly considered to be a man of both substance and taste. When he turned that focused, deliberate attention toward Helen at a company dinner, she had felt, for the first time in years, genuinely and completely seen. Their courtship had been swift and certain. Gerald pursued her with an attentiveness that felt almost old-fashioned, calling when he said he would call, appearing when he said he would appear, remembering small details she had mentioned and referencing them weeks later in ways that made her feel treasured. He told her she was remarkable. He told her she was exactly the kind of woman he had spent years looking for. He told her, 3 months before he proposed, that loving her was the easiest thing he had ever done. Helen had believed every word. Because people like Helen, people who have spent their lives quietly making themselves useful, rarely asking for anything in return, convinced on some fundamental level that they must earn the space they occupy, are extraordinarily vulnerable to being genuinely seen, even briefly, even partially, even by someone who will eventually reveal that what they were seeing was never quite the full picture. The wedding was small, held in Burlington on a rainy Saturday in October. Helen wore a cream-colored dress she had chosen herself, carried flowers from a local market, and walked toward Gerald with the particular joy of someone who has waited a long time for something and is finally allowing themselves to believe it has arrived. Rebecca had stood at the reception with her arms crossed and her expression carved from something colder than polite indifference, watching Helen with the flat, assessing eyes of someone who had already decided the outcome of a situation and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. She was 30 years old, poised and immaculately dressed, possessed of her father's confidence, but none of his warmth, at least none that she ever directed toward Helen. "My father has always had a weakness for women who make themselves useful," she had said to Helen that evening, her voice low and pleasant, her smile a precise social instrument. "I'm sure you'll be very comfortable here." For a while, Helen had told herself it was nerves. Grief, perhaps, for a mother the children had lost years before. The natural resistance of adult children watching a parent move forward. She had told herself all the reasonable, generous things that people tell themselves when they are not yet ready to understand what they are actually seeing. Derek had been quieter about his hostility, which in some ways made it more corrosive. He had a talent for saying things that landed like small, clean cuts. Remarks about Helen's background delivered with a smile, observations about her lack of formal education framed as innocent curiosity, questions about her previous career that managed to simultaneously acknowledge and diminish it. He never raised his voice. He never said anything overtly cruel. He simply made sure, in every interaction across 22 years, that Helen understood precisely where she stood in the hierarchy of people his father was permitted to value. Travis had been the most openly hostile and paradoxically the easiest to manage because his resentment was at least straightforward. He made no effort to disguise his contempt for his father's choice. He skipped holidays when he knew Helen would be present, made cutting remarks about her cooking at the dinners he did attend, and had once told Gerald within Helen's clear hearing that he had married down in every possible sense of the word. Gerald had laughed uncomfortably and changed the subject. Helen had gone to the kitchen and stood at the sink for several long minutes, breathing carefully, until she trusted herself to return to the table with her composure intact. That was the rhythm of those 22 years. Endure, absorb, maintain the composure, swallow the voice, show up the next day, and do it all again. She had managed Gerald's household with a devotion that went entirely unacknowledged, hosting his professional dinners, maintaining his properties, supporting his decisions, reshaping her own preferences and opinions to fit the contours of his life with a seamlessness that she had once mistaken for love and would eventually recognize as the slow, quiet erasure of everything she had once been. She had been so busy building his world that she had not noticed, until far too late, that she had entirely stopped building her own. The divorce proceedings lasted 4 months. 4 months of sitting across conference tables from Gerald and his team of expensive, carefully selected attorneys, while Franklin Webb, the modest family lawyer Helen had managed to retain with the last of her personal savings, did his best against opponents who outmatched him in both resources and ruthlessness. Gerald's legal team was methodical and precise, dismantling every argument Franklin raised with the calm efficiency of people who had done this many times before and expected to win, because they always did. Helen sat through every session with her hands folded in her lap and her face composed into an expression of careful stillness, because she had spent 22 years perfecting the art of not revealing what she was actually feeling in rooms full of people who would use it against her. The financial picture that emerged across those 4 months was both shocking and, in retrospect, entirely predictable. Gerald had spent the better part of their marriage carefully and legally structuring his assets in ways that minimized what could be considered jointly owned. Properties held in corporate entities established before their marriage. investment accounts in his name alone, justified by the argument that Helen had never contributed financially to their acquisition. A web of holding companies and trusts that Franklin took one look at and described, with admirable restraint, as extraordinarily well organized. Gerald had been planning this, or something very much like it, for a long time, possibly from the very beginning. That particular realization arrived quietly one evening as Helen sat in her temporary studio apartment, and it settled into her chest like cold water filling a room. The settlement was presented to her on a Tuesday morning in a conference room on the fourth floor of a glass office building in Burlington. Gerald sat across from her, flanked by two attorneys, his expression professionally neutral in the way that people practice when they want to appear reasonable while doing something unreasonable. Rebecca sat beside him, uninvited but apparently unchallenged, her presence a statement of its own. Derek and Travis had not come, but Helen was certain they had been briefed. She imagined them waiting somewhere comfortable, entirely unconcerned about the outcome. Franklin walked her through the document with the careful, pained thoroughness of a man delivering genuinely bad news. The family home in Burlington, a beautiful colonial that Helen had spent years restoring room by room with her own hands, went to Gerald, valued at $1.4 million. The investment portfolio, accumulated across their marriage from ventures Helen had supported and facilitated and never once been invited to understand, went to Gerald, valued at approximately $2.8 million. The vacation property in Stowe went to Gerald. The vehicles went to Gerald. The joint savings account, which Helen had believed held approximately $60,000, had been drawn down over the preceding 18 months to a remaining balance of $340, which would be split equally between them. $170. That was her share of 22 years of marriage. Helen sat very still and said nothing. There was, Franklin continued, one additional asset being transferred to Helen as part of the settlement. A property Gerald had acquired 12 years earlier through a business transaction, a property he had never developed, never sold, and apparently never visited. Located at 12 Hollow Creek Road on the rural eastern edge of Greystone, Vermont. A house and a half-acre of land it sat on. Deed transferred to Helen's name in full. Gerald's attorney slid the property documentation across the table. Rebecca, who had been silent until this moment, leaned slightly forward with the particular satisfaction of someone who has been waiting to deliver a specific piece of information. "I should mention," she said, her voice carrying that familiar pleasant sharpness, "that the property has been vacant for over 11 years. There were some issues with the previous occupant. The town has a certain history with the place. But at least it's somewhere to go, Helen. That's really something." Franklin requested a brief recess. In the hallway outside the conference room, he told Helen quietly and honestly that he had done everything he could, that Gerald's financial structuring had been virtually impenetrable from a legal standpoint, and that contesting the settlement would cost more in legal fees than she was likely to recover. He looked genuinely distressed. Helen appreciated that about him. She told him she understood and that she was not going to contest it. She signed the documents 40 minutes later with a steady hand. She collected the property deed, the single page of information about 12 Hollow Creek Road, and her copy of the settlement agreement. She shook Franklin's hand, thanked him sincerely, and walked to the elevator without looking back at the conference room table where Gerald and Rebecca were already speaking in low, relieved voices about something that had nothing to do with her. In the parking garage, she sat in her aging Subaru and opened her wallet. A $20 bill, 2 ones, and some change. The deed to a house an entire town had avoided for 11 years. And whatever was left of herself after 22 years of careful, devoted, methodical disappearance. She started the car and drove. The studio apartment Helen had been renting during the divorce proceedings had been paid through the end of the month, which gave her 11 days before she needed to be somewhere else entirely. 11 days to process the complete dissolution of a life she had spent 22 years constructing, to pack what remained of her personal belongings into the back of an aging Subaru, and to figure out what a 64-year-old woman with no income, no career, no savings, and a deed to an abandoned house in a town she had never visited was actually supposed to do next. She spent the first 2 days doing almost nothing. She sat in the single chair the furnished apartment provided, drank coffee she could barely afford, and stared at the middle distance with the particular blankness of someone whose mind has received more information than it is currently equipped to process. She was not crying, which surprised her. She had expected tears, had braced herself for the kind of grief that dismantles you completely. Instead, there was simply a vast, echoing stillness, as though someone had removed something load-bearing from deep inside her. And the structure was still standing, but only just, and only because it hadn't yet fully registered what was missing. On the third day, the phone call started. Rebecca called first. She framed it as concern, which was so transparently false that Helen might have laughed under different circumstances. "I just want to make sure you're thinking practically about your situation," Rebecca said, her voice carrying the particular warmth of someone performing warmth rather than feeling it. "That property in Greystone is not going to be livable, Helen. I'm telling you that as someone who actually wants what's best for you. Sell it as quickly as you can. Take whatever you get for it, and use that money to find yourself a small apartment somewhere manageable. You're 64. You need stability, not some project." Helen thanked her politely and ended the call. Derek called the following day with a similar message, delivered in his characteristically indirect style. He spoke for 12 minutes without once saying anything directly, but the subtext was consistent and clear. The Greystone property was worthless. Selling it was the only sensible option, and he happened to know a property developer who might be willing to take it off her hands quickly and without complication. He did not mention that the developer was almost certainly connected to Gerald. He did not need to. Helen had spent 22 years learning to read the spaces between Derek's words. Travis did not call. He sent a text message that read simply, "Smart women cut their losses early." Just saying. Helen read it once, set her phone face down on the kitchen counter, and did not respond. What none of them knew, what they were perhaps too certain of their own victory to consider, was that their calls were having precisely the opposite of their intended effect. Every conversation, every carefully managed suggestion that she surrender the one thing the settlement had given her, was slowly and steadily replacing the numbness in Helen's chest with something considerably more useful. Not quite anger, not yet, but a quiet, gathering resolve that felt like the first reliable solid ground she had found in months. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She began researching Greystone on the fourth day. What she found was sparse and somewhat unsettling. Greystone was a small rural community of approximately 800 residents in eastern Vermont, the kind of town that appeared on maps primarily as a reference point for more prominent neighboring areas. It had a general store, a diner, a volunteer fire department, a church, and a library. It also had, according to a handful of scattered local news articles and community forum posts she managed to locate through increasingly specific searches, a particular and well-documented unease surrounding a property on Hollow Creek Road. The details were vague and inconsistent in the way that local rumors always are. Secondhand accounts layered over older secondhand accounts until the original facts, if there had ever been clear facts to begin with, were almost entirely obscured. But the consistent thread across everything she read was this: no one in Greystone went near the house at 12 Hollow Creek Road. No one had in over 11 years. The previous occupant had been described variously as a recluse, an eccentric, and in one particularly dramatic forum post, as someone who had left the property under circumstances nobody in town had ever fully explained or entirely agreed upon. Children apparently crossed to the opposite side of the road when passing the turnoff for Hollow Creek. The woman who ran the local diner had reportedly refused to deliver food there even when asked directly. A contractor hired to assess the property 2 years after it was vacated had reportedly walked off the job within an hour of arriving and declined to discuss what he had seen inside. Helen read all of it carefully, and then she sat for a long time in the gathering dark of her studio apartment, looking at the property deed on the table beside her coffee cup. Then she began to pack. She did not pack everything. The clothes Gerald had preferred she left in the closet without ceremony. Designer items that had always felt like a costume she was required to perform in rather than clothing she had chosen for herself. She took the things that were genuinely hers. Practical clothes she actually liked. Her mother's china, carefully wrapped in dish towels, a small collection of books that had belonged to her father, photographs from her life before Gerald that she had kept in a box at the back of the closet for 22 years like evidence of a previous self she hadn't quite been permitted to be. 3 boxes and 2 bags. 22 years reduced to what fit in the back of a Subaru with room to spare. On the morning of the 11th day, Helen Marsh loaded her car in the pale early light, returned the apartment key to the building manager, and drove east toward Greystone, Vermont, toward a house that an entire town avoided, toward a future she could not yet see the shape of, and away from the life that had spent 2 decades quietly consuming her. She told herself she was not afraid. She was not entirely certain that was true, but she drove anyway, because the only direction left was forward, and because 64 years of living had taught her, if nothing else, that the things we fear most rarely turn out to be exactly what we imagine they would be. Sometimes they are worse, and sometimes, occasionally, miraculously, against all reasonable expectation, they turn out to be something else entirely. Greystone, Vermont announced itself with no particular fanfare. There was no welcome sign, no decorative archway, no indication that the town considered its own existence worth celebrating or advertising to passing strangers. The main road simply narrowed slightly. The tree line pulled back on both sides, and suddenly there were buildings, modest, practical, clearly decades old, arranged around a small central square with the unpretentious confidence of a place that had never needed to impress anyone and had long since stopped trying. Helen drove slowly, partly because the road warranted it and partly because she needed a moment to absorb where she was. The general store occupied a corner position with a hand-painted wooden sign and a porch where 2 elderly men sat in chairs despite the cool morning air, watching her car pass with the unhurried attentiveness of people for whom the arrival of an unfamiliar vehicle was a genuinely notable event. A small diner with checkered curtains in the windows sat across from a white clapboard church whose steeple needed repainting. A post office the size of a single-car garage. A library that looked as though it had been built sometime in the late 1800s and had decided, with considerable dignity, not to change much since. It was, by any conventional measure, an unremarkable town, and yet something about it felt immediately and unexpectedly human in a way that Burlington, for all its size and amenities, had never quite managed to feel during the years Helen had lived there. She noticed, as she had in the original story of her drive through town, that people were watching her, not with suspicion, or not primarily with suspicion, but with something more complex. Recognition was part of it. Anticipation, perhaps. An elderly woman sweeping the steps of the general store paused and looked up as Helen's Subaru passed, her expression shifting from neutral to something more attentive. A middle-aged man, refueling a pickup truck at the single gas station on the edge of the square, turned to follow the car with his eyes. 2 women talking outside the diner stopped mid-conversation and watched in silence until she had passed. Helen noted all of this and found it more curious than alarming. Small towns notice strangers. That was simply what small towns did. She did not yet understand that the particular quality of attention she was receiving was not the ordinary curiosity directed at any unfamiliar face, but something more specific and more weighted, the watchfulness of people who had been told something was coming and were now witnessing its arrival. Her GPS directed her off the main square onto a paved side road that became gravel after half a mile, then became a single-lane dirt track that cut through increasingly dense woodland. The trees here were enormous. Ancient maples and oaks whose canopy closed overhead and filtered the pale October light into something dim and cathedral quiet. The undergrowth on both sides of the track was thick and largely untouched, the kind of dense, layered woodland that accumulates over decades of complete, undisturbed growth. There were no other properties visible. No driveways, no mailboxes, no indication that anything human existed beyond the narrow dirt track and the pressing forest on either side. Helen drove carefully, her Subaru's clearance barely adequate for the rutted ground. After approximately a mile, the track curved sharply to the left and then opened without warning into a clearing, and Helen stopped the car and sat for a long moment before she could bring herself to look directly at what lay before her. The house at 12 Hollow Creek Road was not what she had expected. She realized in that first moment of seeing it that she had been bracing herself for obvious ruin. Collapsed sections, broken windows, the kind of visible decay that announces itself immediately and removes all ambiguity about a structure's condition. What she found instead was something considerably more difficult to categorize. The house was large, larger than she had imagined from the sparse property documentation. A two-story Victorian structure built from dark timber and pale stone, with a steeply pitched roof and wide covered porch that wrapped around the entire front face of the building. It was old, unmistakably and profoundly old, the kind of building that carries its age visibly in every weathered board and mossy stone surface. The paint, once white, had faded to a gray that almost exactly matched the overcast Vermont sky, giving the structure a quality of having partially merged with its surroundings, as though the forest were slowly and patiently absorbing it. The windows were intact, every single one of them, which surprised her. 11 years vacant and not a single broken pane. The porch boards appeared sound from where she sat. The roof, though heavily moss-covered, showed no obvious signs of catastrophic failure. The structure was not, by any objective assessment she could make from the driver's seat of her car, actively falling apart. But there was something about it, something she could not immediately name or rationally explain, a quality that went beyond the obvious signs of long neglect, beyond the overgrown grounds and the peeling paint and the profound, pressing silence that surrounded the clearing completely. Standing there in the dim October light with the ancient trees at its back, the house felt less like an abandoned building and more like something that had been waiting. Deliberately, patiently, with the particular stillness of something that possesses both the capacity and the intention to wait for precisely as long as necessary. Helen sat in her car for a full 5 minutes before she opened the door and stepped out. The air in the clearing was different from the air on the road. Cooler, completely still, carrying the smell of deep woodland and something older beneath it, earth and stone, and the particular mineral quality of a place where water runs close to the surface. Her footsteps on the overgrown path toward the porch sounded very loud in the silence. The porch steps held her weight without complaint. The front door, heavy and dark and carved from timber she didn't recognize, had a single iron lock that looked as though it had not been touched in years. She fitted the rusty key from her settlement documents into the lock. It turned, with some resistance, then with a smoothness that surprised her, and the door swung inward, and Helen Marsh crossed the threshold of 12 Hollow Creek Road, and everything she thought she understood about why she was there began, immediately and irrevocably, to change. The interior of the house stopped her completely. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, one hand still resting on the door frame, and simply looked because what she was seeing required looking at before it could begin to be understood. She had expected emptiness. The hollow, dusty interior of a building that had been abandoned for over a decade. Peeling walls, debris, the particular desolation of a space that has been left without care for long enough that it begins to forget it was ever inhabited. What she found instead was a house that was not only structurally sound, but furnished, maintained, and in ways she could not yet explain, clearly and deliberately prepared for someone's arrival. The main room was large and low-ceilinged, its walls paneled in dark timber that had been polished to a warm glow relatively recently, certainly not 11 years ago. A stone fireplace occupied the far wall, its hearth clean, a stack of split firewood arranged beside it with obvious intention. The furniture was old but well kept. A long oak table, several chairs upholstered in dark fabric, a wide sofa positioned before the fireplace with a folded wool blanket draped across its arm. The floors, wide-planked and dark with age, had been swept. The windows, from the inside, were clean. Someone had been here. Not 11 years ago. Recently. Helen moved further into the room, her footsteps careful, her eyes moving across every surface. There were shelves built into the wall beside the fireplace, and on those shelves, arranged with obvious care, were objects, not random abandoned belongings, but a curated collection of items that appeared both deliberately chosen and deliberately placed. Books, old and leather-bound, their spines faded but legible. Small framed photographs. A collection of hand-drawn maps of the surrounding woodland. Several journals, identical in size, their covers worn with use. She crossed to the shelves and picked up one of the framed photographs. It showed the house itself, 12 Hollow Creek Road, in what appeared to be summer, surrounded by formal gardens in full bloom, the grounds immaculately maintained, the exterior freshly painted. It was beautiful in a way the current exterior only hinted at. She turned the photograph over. On the back, in handwriting she did not recognize, someone had written, "For whoever finds their way here. This is what it can be again." Helen set the photograph down carefully and stood very still. She heard footsteps on the porch behind her. She turned to find a woman standing in the open doorway, solidly built, somewhere in her mid-70s, with close-cropped silver hair and the kind of direct, undecorated face that belongs to people who have spent their lives doing practical things and have never particularly needed anyone's approval for it. She was carrying a canvas bag that appeared to contain food, and she was looking at Helen with an expression of complete and unsurprised recognition. "You'll be Helen," the woman said. It was not a question. "Yes," Helen managed. "How did you?" "Agnes Porter." The woman stepped inside and set the canvas bag on the oak table as though she had done this many times before, which, Helen would shortly discover, she had. "I run the general store on the square. I've been maintaining this house for the past 3 years, keeping it ready. Gerald Marsh contacted me through an intermediary. Paid for everything up front, supplies, cleaning, firewood, basic repairs. He said a woman named Helen would eventually arrive with a deed and a rusty key, and that when she did, I was to make sure she had everything she needed and understood what she was actually standing in." Helen stared at her. "Gerald sent you?" Agnes's expression shifted into something more complex. "Gerald Marsh paid me, yes. But what I'm going to tell you next has nothing to do with Gerald Marsh, and everything to do with the woman who owned this house before him." She moved to the fireplace and began, with practiced efficiency, to lay a fire. As she worked, she talked, and what she said dismantled and rebuilt Helen's understanding of where she was and why, piece by deliberate piece. The house at 12 Hollow Creek Road had been built in 1887 by a woman named Constance Albright, a widow who had arrived in Greystone with very little and built, over the following decades, what Agnes described as a quiet but substantial empire. Constance had understood land and timber in ways that were considered remarkable for the era, had acquired parcels of surrounding woodland systematically over 30 years, and had died in 1931, leaving behind an estate that her family had almost entirely failed to manage competently and had subsequently, over generations, mostly sold off or lost. The house itself had passed through several owners across the following decades and had acquired its dark local reputation in stages. There had been a difficult period in the 1970s involving an occupant whose behavior had alarmed the community. Then a quieter period of ordinary vacancy. Then Gerald Marsh had acquired it 12 years ago through a debt settlement, never visited it, and never developed it, and most of Greystone had continued to give it a wide berth out of accumulated habit and inherited unease. But what Agnes said next was what made Helen sit down heavily in the nearest chair. "Constance Albright was your great-grandmother's sister," Agnes said quietly, turning from the now crackling fire to look directly at Helen. "I know that because Gerald Marsh's intermediary told me, and because I confirmed it myself through the town records we keep at the library. Your family connection to this property is documented and legitimate, and it predates Gerald Marsh's ownership by nearly a century, which means what he did, acquiring this house through a business transaction and then including it in a divorce settlement as though it were merely an inconvenient asset he was discarding, was either a coincidence so extraordinary it defies reasonable explanation, or it was something considerably more deliberate." She crossed to the shelves and retrieved a collection of identical journals, setting them on the table in front of Helen. Constance kept detailed records of everything: her land acquisitions, her financial dealings, the history of this property, and the woodland surrounding it. These are her original journals. And in the last one, Agnes opened the final journal to a page marked with a faded ribbon. She wrote about a great niece she had never met, the daughter of a family member who had moved north, and she wrote that the house should, if justice ever found its way here, return to that line eventually. Helen looked at the open journal. The handwriting was small and precise and very old. Her eyes found a single sentence near the bottom of the page and stopped there. This house was built for women who needed it most. May it always find its way to one. Agnes reached into the canvas bag and produced a thick envelope, cream-colored, sealed. This was left here 3 years ago when Gerald's intermediary first contacted me. Instructions were that it be given to you when you arrived, not before. Helen's name was written on the front, not in Gerald's handwriting, in a hand she did not recognize, formal and deliberate, as though each letter had been considered carefully before being committed to the page. She broke the seal with hands that trembled and began to read. The letter was 4 pages long, written on heavy cream paper in that same formal, deliberate hand. It was signed at the bottom by a woman named Eleanor Voss, identified in the opening paragraph as a private attorney retained anonymously 3 years prior to prepare and safeguard documents related to the property at 12 Hollow Creek Road. Eleanor Voss wrote with the precise, unembellished clarity of someone whose professional life had been spent reducing complex situations to their essential facts. And the facts she presented were both stunning in their specificity and devastating in their implications. Gerald Marsh had not acquired 12 Hollow Creek Road through an ordinary debt settlement. He had acquired it deliberately, through a carefully constructed legal arrangement designed to obscure the true nature of the transaction. After discovering through genealogical research conducted by a firm he had hired 6 years into his marriage to Helen that the property had a documented historical connection to Helen's maternal family line. He had known, for 16 of their 22 years together, that his wife had a legitimate ancestral claim to the house he had quietly purchased and never developed and never mentioned. He had known, and he had said nothing, not because he intended to return it to her, but because information, as Eleanor Voss wrote with admirable restraint, had always been Gerald Marsh's preferred form of currency. What he had not anticipated, or had perhaps underestimated, was that the same genealogical research firm he had retained had also been retained, some years later, by Eleanor Voss herself on behalf of an anonymous client whose identity the letter declined to reveal, but whose instructions had been explicit and comprehensive. That client had discovered Gerald's acquisition, discovered his concealment of the property's history from Helen, and had arranged, through a series of carefully executed legal and financial steps, to ensure that when Gerald Marsh eventually chose to discard his wife, as everyone who knew him had understood he eventually would, the house would go to Helen as part of the settlement, and Helen would find, upon arriving, everything she needed to understand the full dimensions of what she had actually been given. The property at 12 Hollow Creek Road, Eleanor Voss wrote, sat on 63 acres of old-growth woodland that had been assessed 18 months prior at a value of approximately $2.7 million to conservation organizations that had already expressed formal interest in acquisition. The house itself, as a documented historical structure with clear provenance to a notable early Vermont female landowner, carried its own significant value to historical preservation societies and had been the subject of 2 acquisition inquiries in the past 4 years alone. The combined value of the property was conservatively estimated at $3.4 million. Gerald Marsh had included it in the divorce settlement as a worthless throwaway. It was the single most valuable asset in the entire settlement by a considerable margin. There was more. The filing cabinet in the back room of the house, Agnes pointed Helen toward a door she had not yet opened, contained documentation accumulated over 3 years by Eleanor Voss's anonymous client. Documentation pertaining to Gerald Marsh's business dealings across 20 years of property development, including several transactions that had not been conducted with complete transparency toward either his financial partners or the relevant regulatory authorities. Documentation pertaining to Rebecca's involvement in 2 of those transactions as a silent partner. Documentation pertaining to a specific arrangement Derek had facilitated between his father's company and a zoning official in Burlington that had resulted in a development approval that should not, under any legitimate reading of the relevant regulations, have been granted. Helen read the letter twice, then sat in the firelit room for a long time without speaking. Agnes waited with the patience of someone who understood that certain kinds of information require a period of silence before they can be properly absorbed. "Who is the anonymous client?" Helen finally asked. Agnes looked at her steadily. "The letter doesn't say, but I've lived in Greystone my whole life, and I've learned that the people who do the most important things quietly are usually the people who understand that the value of a thing isn't diminished by going unrecognized. Whoever it was, they spent 3 years making sure you be protected when you got here. That's not nothing." Helen nodded slowly and set the letter on the table beside Constance Albright's journals. 3 weeks later, a black Range Rover appeared at the end of the dirt track leading to 12 Hollow Creek Road. Helen watched it from the upstairs window, recognizing Rebecca's vehicle immediately. It was followed by a second car she identified as Derek's. They parked at the edge of the clearing and got out, and she watched them absorb the house with expressions that moved through confusion and recalibration and arrived, inevitably, at a sharpened, calculating attention that she recognized from 22 years of close observation. She went downstairs, smoothed her jacket, and opened the front door before they reached the porch steps. "Rebecca," she said pleasantly. "Derek, what a surprise. Please come in." They entered with the careful confidence of people who believe they hold the superior position and want to ensure that understanding is immediately established. Rebecca's eyes moved across the room with the speed and precision of someone conducting a rapid asset assessment. Derek looked at the shelves, the journals, the filing cabinet door visible through the back room entrance, and something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression. They sat. Helen made tea, moving through the kitchen with the unhurried composure of someone entirely at home. She served it in her mother's china and sat across from them without rushing, without filling the silence prematurely, without any of the nervous accommodation that 22 years of living with their father had trained into her. She was done accommodating. She simply waited. Rebecca spoke first, her voice carrying that familiar precision-engineered warmth. "Helen, we've had the property assessed. We think Dad genuinely didn't understand what he was including in the settlement. Our attorneys believe there's a strong argument that an asset of this value shouldn't have been transferred without proper disclosure of its worth. We're not here to be difficult. We just want to discuss a fair resolution." "There's nothing to discuss," Helen said quietly. Derek leaned forward slightly. "Helen, be reasonable. Dad made a mistake. The settlement was based on an incorrect valuation. Any court would." "Would what?" Helen said. Her voice was still quiet. It was, she realized, the quietest she had felt in years. "Would look very carefully at the documentation I have in that filing cabinet over there. Documentation about your father's business arrangements across the past 20 years. Documentation about a zoning approval in Burlington that your father's company shouldn't have received and that you facilitated, Derek. Documentation about your involvement, Rebecca, as a silent partner in 2 transactions that were not disclosed to your father's financial partners." The room was very still. "I want to be completely clear with you both," Helen continued. "This property is mine. It was documented as mine through a legitimate divorce settlement. It has ancestral connections to my family that predate your father's ownership by nearly a century, and I have legal counsel who will make both of those facts extremely clear to any court that needs to hear them. I also have documentation that neither of you want made public. Your father collected information the way careful people do, methodically, thoroughly, and with obvious foresight." She looked at them both steadily. "So here's what I am offering you, and I want you to understand that it is the only offer I will make. Walk away. Accept the settlement as it stands. Return to your lives and leave me to mine. We never need to see each other or speak again. But if you come after this property, if you file a single legal motion, if you make a single phone call to a single attorney about challenging my ownership, I will release every piece of documentation in that cabinet to every relevant authority and publication that might find it interesting. Travis had not come with his siblings. He called that evening. The conversation lasted less than 3 minutes. Rebecca and Derek's attorney contacted Franklin Webb the following week to confirm that no legal challenge to the divorce settlement would be pursued. Franklin called Helen to relay the message, and she could hear the satisfaction in his voice from across the phone line. "Whatever you said to them," he told her, "it worked." "I said the truth," Helen replied simply. "It turns out that's usually enough when you say to people who have reasons to be afraid of it." She set her phone on the oak table beside Constance Albright's journals, looked around the fire-lit room that was becoming, with each passing day, more genuinely and completely hers, and felt something she had not felt in so long that it took her a full moment to identify it. She felt safe, not the performed safety of someone who has learned to appear unafraid. Real safety, the kind that lives in the bones and doesn't require maintenance. It was, she thought, an extraordinary thing to feel at 64, and she intended to protect it with everything she had. The seasons turned in Greystone with a quiet drama that Helen had never experienced in the city. Autumn deepened into the kind of Vermont winter that announces itself without apology. Heavy snow settling across the clearing, the ancient trees standing in their white-coated silence like patient witnesses, the house at 12, Hollow Creek Road holding its warmth against the cold with a solidity that felt almost personal, almost intentional, as though the old timber and stone walls understood their purpose and took it seriously. Helen learned the rhythms of the wood stove in the main room, learned which windows let in the best morning light, learned the particular creak of the third porch step and the way the wind moved through the canopy of the surrounding oaks in a way that sounded, on certain evenings, remarkably like a conversation in a language she was only beginning to learn. She was, for the first time in 22 years, living entirely on her own terms. The realization arrived not as a single dramatic moment, but as a gradual accumulation of small, ordinary freedoms. Waking at the hour she chose, eating what she wanted when she wanted it, spending an entire afternoon reading Constance Albright's journals without once adjusting her behavior to accommodate another person's preference or expectation. These are not remarkable things. They were the most ordinary things in the world. And yet, after 22 years of organizing her entire existence around Gerald's comfort and Gerald's schedule and Gerald's carefully maintained image of a successful man with an appropriately managed household, they felt nothing short of extraordinary. Agnes became the closest friend Helen had ever had. They fell into an easy daily rhythm. Morning coffee at the general store when Helen came into town, long conversations that ranged from the practical to the philosophical, the particular companionship of two women who had both spent significant portions of their lives being underestimated and had arrived, through different routes, at the same quiet and unassailable confidence in their own worth. Agnes introduced her to the rest of Greystone with characteristic directness, and the town received her with a warmth that continued to surprise and move her. Pastor William at the small white church greeted her by name from the first Sunday she attended. The young librarian, a thoughtful woman named Carol, discovered Helen's organizational background and recruited her almost immediately into a project to digitize and preserve the town's historical records. The elderly gentleman from the general store porch, whose name turned out to be Arthur, stopped by the house one February morning with a chainsaw and spent an entire day clearing fallen timber from the property boundaries without being asked and without accepting payment. She belonged somewhere. Not because she was someone's wife, not because she was performing a role that someone else had written for her, but because she had shown up as herself, uncertain and bruised, and carrying the accumulated weight of 2 decades of quiet erasure. And the town had simply, straightforwardly, made room for her. In early spring, Helen contacted Eleanor Voss directly. The conversation lasted 2 hours and covered considerable ground. The anonymous client who had arranged for Helen's protection, Eleanor confirmed, had requested that their identity remain permanently undisclosed. Helen accepted this with more peace than she might have expected, because she had arrived at an understanding that felt more important than knowing the name. Someone had seen what was happening to her and had chosen, at significant personal effort and expense, to ensure she would not be left without recourse. That act of anonymous care, the decision to protect a stranger simply because it was the right thing to do, moved her more deeply than any identified gesture could have. She had the property formally assessed in April. The conservation organization that had previously expressed interest made an offer within 3 weeks, not for the full acreage, but for 40 of the 63 acres of old-growth woodland, leaving the house, its immediate grounds, and a generous surrounding buffer entirely in Helen's possession. The sale generated enough to ensure her financial security for the remainder of her life, with a substantial remainder. She donated a portion immediately and anonymously to the Greystone Library Fund. She established a small scholarship in Constance Albright's name for young women from rural Vermont pursuing further education. She set aside what she needed for the restoration of the house and gardens, hiring local workers who brought their own histories and knowledge of the land, who told her stories about the property and the surrounding forest over lunch breaks that stretched into long afternoons of conversation. The restoration took most of the summer. The gardens that had been visible in that old photograph, the formal beds, the kitchen garden, the wide lawn bordered by ancient hedgerows, emerged slowly from beneath 11 years of growth like something that had been waiting for permission to return. Helen worked alongside the hired crew whenever her hands were needed, learning as she went, making decisions based on what she wanted rather than what anyone else expected of her. By August, the fountain was running again, clear water catching the summer light in the center of the restored front garden. By September, the kitchen garden was producing more herbs and vegetables than she could use alone, and she had begun quietly distributing the surplus to neighbors and the community center in town. She was 64 years old, and she was, in every meaningful sense of the word, flourishing. One evening in early October, exactly 1 year after she had first driven down the dirt track toward the house that everyone in Greystone had avoided, Helen sat on the restored porch in the blue September dusk and thought about the journey that had delivered her here. The courtroom in Burlington, the $20 bill and the rusty key, the studio apartment and the 11 days of careful, terrified packing, the dirt track through the ancient trees, the house that had been waiting, Agnes at the door with her canvas bag, Constance Albright's journals and Eleanor Voss's letter, and the filing cabinet full of documentation that had never needed to be used because the truth, delivered clearly and without apology, had turned out to be sufficient. She thought about Gerald, who had discarded her with the confident indifference of a man certain he was giving away something worthless, and who had been wrong in every possible direction. She thought about Rebecca and Derek and Travis, living their carefully maintained lives in the city, and she found that she felt nothing toward them that resembled bitterness. Bitterness required continued engagement with the source of injury, and Helen had no interest in remaining engaged with any of them for a single unnecessary moment. They had simply revealed themselves to be exactly what they were. The revelation, however painful, had been genuinely useful. She thought about the anonymous person who had spent 3 years quietly ensuring she would not be left without protection. She thought about Agnes and Arthur and Carol and Pastor William and the entire small, unhurried community that had absorbed her presence without condition or qualification. She thought about Constance Albright, dead nearly a century, who had built this house with her own stubborn vision and written in her journal that it should find its way to women who needed it most. It had. Eventually, by a route so improbable that no one could have designed it deliberately, it had. Helen Marsh was 64 years old. She had been erased and discarded and reduced to a $20 bill and a rusty key and the keys to a house an entire town avoided. She had arrived in Greystone with 3 boxes, 2 bags, and the remnants of a self that had spent 2 decades being systematically diminished. And she had found, behind the door that everyone else had chosen not to open, not ruin but sanctuary, not worthlessness but legacy, not an ending but the most genuine beginning she had ever known. The porch light caught the restored fountain in the garden below, the water moving in the evening air. The oaks stood at the edges of the clearing in their ancient, patient silence. The house held its warmth at her back. She was at 64, exactly where she was always meant to be, and she had not even begun. If this story found you at a moment when you needed it, if you have ever been handed something that looked like nothing and discover it contained everything, leave one word in the comments that describes what you found on the other side of your hardest beginning. Because Helen's story proves what we have always known and sometimes need reminding: that the people who discard you are never the ones who define your value. That the doors everyone else avoids sometimes open into exactly the life you're meant to live. That dignity, once genuinely claimed, belongs to no one else and can be taken by no one. And that it is never, not at 64, not at 74, not at any age that the world might consider too late, ever truly too late to begin. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that what looks like an ending is sometimes a door, and that the key to that door, however rusty, however unlikely, was always in their hand. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.